Want to welcome all of you to the podcast of Church and State, a discussion of people, their beliefs, and how it impacts their politics. Tonight, in our first series of podcasts, we're talking about the separation of church and state. We invite you to follow along and give us your thoughts.
All right, so we're going to continue our conversation. We've been talking about the misunderstanding of separation of the church and state concept, and we've covered briefly a little bit of the history and again the damage that it's done both in the Christian church as far as alienating their members from interacting in government, and then conversely, the damage it's done by removing that moral pillar in the government. And so, Dad, I was going to ask you, what ways do you see that damage continuing on in our society?
But and it's not I don't think it's just, I think it's continuing on, but to make that assumption that it's continuing on, you have to go back and look historically, right? So there was a big movement, in the 1800s, um, especially uh, during, it was highlighted, if you want to call that word highlighted, during the Civil War process, where there were, Christians that took a stand on one side of the issues surrounding the Civil War, and there were Christians on both sides of the issue, just as there was secular people on both sides of the issue during the Civil War. But coming out of that, many of the churches felt um, they felt the need to move away from this idea of being involved in politics. And so when we look at that mid 1800s, late 1800s Reformation period, there was a lot of writings by Campbell and others during that time about the need for uh, members of the church to begin to separate themselves from the government.
Now, Campbell was the founder of which denomination?
He was he actually he never actually named his own organization. It's interesting. Campbell, uh, he started teaching. He was a son of a Presbyterian minister that started up in Pennsylvania, if my memory serves me correct, and he started preaching in the Middle Appalachian areas, uh, basically in the Kentucky areas. Middle Tennessee, or that northern part of Tennessee up into that lower Ohio Valley. And so he taught in there, and he was a more of a circuit rider. So he would go out into the remote villages and towns, and he would preach, and he began to get a great following. He met up with a gentleman out of Tennessee, and they felt that they had similar teachings, and so they combined forces. It's funny that it was after Campbell died and after his uh, associate also died that finally in about 1910, the group that they had founded first identified themselves as the Christian Church and as the Church of Christ. So
Okay.
it was after they died that the organization was named. And so he never really, he actually was never involved in the naming of his organization. So we don't really know um, what he would have named it had he had the opportunity. So, there's a gentleman out of Pepperdine University who wrote a book on the history of the Church of Christ, who gives a lot of this background if you want to go out and read that book and kind of follow up on that. But one of throughout my readings, the church growth and those time frames was that the churches moved away. So there was a pullback. You see that in it portrayed in movies. The movie with the Doss, the private Doss. What was that? Where he was a medic, but he refused to carry a gun.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What was the name of that movie?
Oh, Hacksaw Ridge.
Hacksaw Ridge,
Hacksaw
right?
Ridge, yeah.
So we have this portrayed here. He was a very religious man, and then the movie actually does
I think it does a good
does an
job.
interesting job
Yeah.
of juxtapositioning the non-religious people, carrying guns, the religious guy not carrying a gun, right, being the pacifist, if you will, willing to serve, but nevertheless the pacifist. I'm not going to carry a gun. I'm not going to kill somebody, and we saw that during this late 1800s, early 1900s time, this battle in the churches about murder versus participating in war. And during that time, they had swung to this pendulum over to where, they were not going to kill. There's anecdotally a story about the
You even
church.
had the movie Sergeant York,
Yeah,
right, where he didn't want he spent many days before actually participating in World War II. He was out of Tennessee, right? And
yeah,
he had very strong religious beliefs, but he was very hesitant to enter the war and participate in it.
right.
So there's many examples of from that basically post Civil War time frame to World War One, World War II, where there was hesitation of participating.
Yeah, of religious people from participating in war.
Correct.
And we see it portrayed. The movies do a great job of just juxtapositioning these, the non-religious people, that they have no qualms, and the religious people, they're falling in on the side of the pacifists, the non-aggressors, love your neighbor, don't participate in war, you can't kill, blah blah blah. And uh, and because that was a common thought during that time frame, it even went to the point that during World War II, uh, churches were so adamant. There were some churches that were so adamantly pacifist that they had crossed the boundary and they had gone into anti-war protest. And World War II was a different time, so even though we had anti-war protests in the 60s, we forget that there were anti-war protests during the 40s and there were anti-war protests during World War One.
Yes.
We forget that those events happened
Correct.
because the government shut them down.
Right.
The government couldn't have a population divided against itself. And
Right.
so it was interesting that under the threat of imprisonment, some of the churches all of a sudden found themselves reevaluating their position and saying, "Oh, we're all for this thing."
Right. Right.
So, but that is in situations like that damage both the government and the religions, right?
Correct.
So if a government has to come to a church and say, you're anti-war, your pacifist anti-war protests are impacting our war efforts, and we need you to stop that, and then all of a sudden you theologically change and support the war, how does that impact your credibility as a church,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I mean, you're creating a lot of hypocrisy for your members and for people that will analytically look at your church in
Yeah, for
future.
people outside your church,
Right.
they look at your church and say, "How in the world can all of a sudden,
You
you know?"
swing so strongly back.
So yeah,
Yeah.
or and then how bad does it look to people when the government has to say, "Okay, you've crossed a boundary here. We really need you to back off on this." We don't do that anymore, right? So we very seldom have the government come into a church and tell them to do this. We threaten them now with their 401c
Right.
tax
Yeah,
exempt
that's
status,
right.
right?
That's right.
But we don't actually send in the troops to threaten them anymore.
Right.
We send in the IRS to
Yes,
threaten.
right. Because money is the great motivator of
And
everything.
it's the great
Yeah,
motivator
correct.
in many of these situations. So, but because of this, the damage occurs on both sides, and we see that played out today in the headlines, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
The government's the bad guy, depending on which news channel you listen to. The government's the bad guy, or the government's the good guy,
Right.
right? It's all based on your belief system, right?
Yes.
And the same thing with, when we're trying to keep religion out of politics, depending upon where you position yourself on that, that's either a good thing or that's a bad thing.
Right.
We've moved away from analytically looking at problems to just emotionally looking at them.
And speaking to that hypocrisy point, growing up in the church, and I went to a very secular university, University of Tennessee, but I had a lot of friends, and we all went to church. But what I always struggled with greatly on that same avenue of you say one thing and yet you're doing another, or when you get threatened or you get challenged, that kind of doesn't make any sense. Well, along that same avenue, I had a lot of friends, and we would talk about Bible, we would talk about religious topics, and they were in support, whether it was on topics of abortion or war or any other. I'm sure if I pressed my mind, I could think of a lot of other topics. As they said, they believed one way religiously, but they would vote a different way politically. And I just thought to myself over and over, how can someone outside of the church give that individual any form of credibility as a logically functioning individual, but also I can't follow them because they don't have a path forward, right? They're wishy-washy because they go one way for religion and they go another way politically, and to me that makes no sense at all.
Right. I think that at some level, they're basically lying to you or themselves, or
One or the other.
right.
Right, yeah,
Because
exactly.
what you fundamentally hold to and what you fundamentally cling to is what you do.
Yes.
Right. As we've often discussed throughout life, a person is who they are. Right.
Right.
At the end of the day, when they're, as you so eloquently put it the other day, your life is like a sponge, and you absorb things, and when you step on a sponge and it squirts out the fluid that's in it, that's what is truly within it, right?
Yes.
So when a person is pressured, whatever comes out of them is who they truly are,
Right.
right? And in so many ways, a political persuasion is more powerful in today's environment
Yes.
than a religious persuasion. People will often cave to religious positions quicker than they will to religious positions, because religion in many cases is social. It's not something that governs your life. It's a social
It's a
activity.
suggestion almost.
Yeah, it's a it's something that we want to be associated with because we know the people that go to church is going to invite you over for dinner on Sunday,
Right.
kind of thing, right?
Right. Yeah, and so I think, I don't mean to be judgmental, but I do believe that the true beliefs, the true morals of that individual shines brightest in the ballot box.
Yeah.
Right. They go to church because it's socially expected. It makes them feel good, but then they go and they cast a vote based upon what they actually truly believe and feel.
Yeah.
And so that I think when we have removed that, or we've taught separation of church and state, again, it's severely damaging because now we have essentially two-faced people serving in the church, leading the church even sometimes, and that's not a good front. That's not a good uh, face for the church to have.
Right. And that's the reason that churches are looked at as being so hypocritical in so
Correct.
many ways, right?
Right.
And so it damages the church because the person is maybe standing up and greeting you at the back door and saying one thing, but they know who you are in reality.
In reality, that's right. And so if you come to them as trying to help them, they aren't going to listen to you
Right.
in any way, form. Another one, though, I want to cover as well that I find scary is, again, have had a lot of friends throughout the years in church. I'm still friends with a lot of them, but I had a friend, and she believed that you shouldn't vote, and she wouldn't listen to any politics whatsoever. She was very non-political, which I find somewhat hard to believe, again, because your moral code, right, paints the picture of your geopolitical world, right? But anyway, but so she wouldn't she wouldn't vote, and she wouldn't listen to any news. She wouldn't stay up to date on anything, and basically tried to remove herself as far from that as possible, because her claim was, and it's a scripture that says, we're not of this world. When we become a Christian, we're not of this world. And so she believed that there was no reason to participate in the events of this world. Again, under that line of separation of church and state and all that. And what I find in contradiction is, if you look at examples in the Bible, be it Moses, Joseph, Joshua, David, Solomon, Samuel, they were all political. I mean, they all led the nation, right? Whether it was the Israelite nation or Daniel, right? He was very high up in Babylon, right? And he worked hand in hand with the political leaders of that time in Babylon. You looked at Joseph; he became governor of Egypt, and so again, that's another. I think it's really bad because we are commanded to be we are not of this world, but we still have to live in this world. And I think we need to fight for the morals that are listed in the Bible.
I think so. I think that there are many examples, especially in the Old Testament, where you see um, Jews. I mean, we can talk about, you know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? They were high up in the government. They were part of the talented youth of Israel that had been carried off into captivity, and they had been placed in positions of power there. And it speaks to the fact that, you know, being a Christian does not make you incapable of serving in government. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have examples not only of religious people serving in governments where the governments agreed with them theologically, but we also have a lot of examples in the Old Testament where there were theological Jews that served in what would have been considered the pagan nations surrounding them, where they were carried off into captivity, but they served uh, distinguished in their
Yes.
roles and never sacrificed their beliefs. We've moved away from that today, and we've said, no, if you are dedicated to your religious beliefs, you're incapable of functioning uh, in any type of matter, let alone where you are serving in a manner that would be considered excellent, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so
That's a really good point. I want to highlight it. That's a really good point because they never once sacrificed what they believed.
right.
They were still well respected. They were still extremely capable, and like Joseph, for example, he saved not only Egypt but the surrounding nations because of his foresight and his faith. Right?
Right. And to talk about Joseph, I mean, Joseph could have looked at the opportunity and knew that the famine was coming and said, "Hey, I'm a, I am of Israel,
Right.
and therefore Egypt is my enemy, and so therefore I'm not going to tell them that the
Right.
famine's coming, and I can be proclaimed a great hero here because I can kill all of Egypt by starving
Right.
them to death, right?"
Exactly.
But he didn't,
Right.
right? I mean, he held to his faith. He held to his beliefs. He held to his God, and yet he served in a very idolatrous nation,
Yes.
and he was very successful, and he saved the people.
Yes.
If we go along with the biblical narrative, he was very instrumental in preparing the land of Egypt for the upcoming famine.
Yes.
He didn't serve the nation of Egypt in seeing, oh, how can I belittle them, or how can I hold them down, or how can I, you know, prevent them from doing what they're doing. He served them nobly,
Yes.
right? And today, the challenge for Christian people in politics is to serve nobly, right?
Yes.
Never compromising your beliefs, but standing upon the tenets of your faith to serve your nation, your community, whatever level of government that you're in a noble capacity, to see them succeed,
Yes.
right? And it's through that, it would be through that service that other people will look at you and say, wow, that's a man of integrity, or that's a woman of integrity. That's a person of integrity. They're a good person,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, and so I think that's a good takeaway from this episode really is keep your integrity, right? I mean, keep keep your moral code and show it politically, right? Because again, we've addressed many examples in the Bible when that was done, and nations were saved, lives were changed, and God was elevated in all of those situations.
Yeah.
And so, again, that's very important from a Christian standpoint as far as being of integrity, living up to what you believe religiously, and applying it to politics.
Yeah.
So, and in that way, you benefit both the church and the state.
And the state.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to the podcast of Church and State, hosted by Jared and John. At the core, we hope that we've said something today that simply made you think and expand your horizons. Make sure to comment down below of things you want to hear or topics you want covered. We'll see you on the next one.